Chapter 961 Little King 2 steps away from being the King of China. The advance of the Transcendent faction troops was virtually unstoppable in both northern and southern China. To the south, the troops led by Shangguan Bing Shui, whose alias Blood Queen was now basically known by all factions in the area, whether human or not, broke through all opposition with such ease that those who were still on the list began to waver as to whether they should surrender or continue to put up resistance. She showed no mercy to those that decided to be enemies of her Transcendent faction. Before attacking any base, Shangguan Bing Shui would first make sure to send a diplomat to inform the other side what the Transcendent faction demanded in exchange for not attacking the establishment. The conditions Shangguan Bing Shui set were very simple. There were only two. 1. Surrender unconditionally. 2. Full handover of the power of both the army and the government. In addition, the diplomats sent also made sure to make it clear that under the strict but relatively fair administration established by the Transcendent faction, everyone, even normal survivors, had the opportunity to rise in the noble ranks and even in the army. Everything depended solely and exclusively on one's ability to achieve. Unfortunately, although the words of the envoy's diplomats sounded pretty to the ears, the reality was that the two conditions presented by the Transcendent faction were anything but sweet. After leading their own bases and factions for so long, no one would be willing to surrender the supremacy they enjoyed so easily. Who would settle for breadcrumbs when they had the whole bread? No one. Besides, most of the leaders of the different human bases were just normal people before the apocalypse and worked from dawn to dusk in order to make a living. After gaining power, these people who were frightened by the abrupt change in their lives finally released the demons that the past laws held locked in their hearts. What leader had not used hard or soft methods to force a beauty to sleep with them? What leader had not eliminated one or two survivors just because they broke minor rules in front of them or to cover up the blemishes of a loved one? What leader had not used the classic strategy of snagging powerful soul evolvers through the use of beautiful women and unwilling but beaten virgins trained to obey? With so many blemishes on their records, these leaders knew that the upper echelons of the Transcendent faction would not let them slip away once their wrongdoings began to come to light one by one. After all, the fact that the Transcendent faction had strict rules and policies when it came to the rights of every human was widely known to every faction in China with a radio, as everyone had heard at least once the daily announcements of the Transcendent faction. Therefore, the number of leaders willing to surrender was practically zero during the first month and few days. In fact, there was a time when one of the most violent leaders belonging to a faction claiming to be the new kingdom dared to kill the first diplomat envoy sent by Shangguan Bing Shui in response to his two conditions in exchange for not attacking. It was then that Shangguan Bing Shui's already short patience hit rock bottom. To be honest, she was extremely furious. Killing a diplomat was no different from peeing on the pride and honor of the Transcendent faction, which meant that the leader of the other party was peeing on the efforts not only of Shangguan Bing Shui and many others, but also on that person's efforts. Therefore, she completely broke loose and let her ice creations be unleashed mercilessly. She, together with her mother Shangguan Xinyue, left the main army behind and charged straight towards the enemy's main base, crushing the new kingdom soldiers with no chance of return. Shangguan Bing Shui and Shangguan Xinyue showed no pity and slaughtered all the soul evolvers to the point of leaving none alive before throwing the semi-frozen leader's body for a group of zombies to eat. After this event, even the factions that had intentions to continue fighting began to waver. A small number of them even took the initiative to send a diplomat to one of the Transcendent faction's bases, with the intention of at least negotiating a few favorable terms. Shangguan Bing Shui accepted the terms that she considered were not extravagant, terms that would not affect the work of Wu Yijuan and her people during the process of asserting the reins on each base. As for the terms she did not like, she rejected them and gave each of the leaders a one-day ultimatum to surrender or be killed. Bossy, oppressive, and arrogant, Shangguan Bing Shui's every move, every action, and every word left no room for rejection from anyone. Accept or say goodbye, simple. No matter how displeased the various leaders felt, however, the power of the transcendent faction had already reached a point where it could not be stopped. Even those who tried to ally were crushed, and by the time the most powerful alliance in the east made up of the leaders of Qinghai Province, Tibet, and Gansu Province was defeated after 2 weeks of fighting, all resistance against the transcendent faction completely collapsed. After 1 month and a half of war and bloodshed, the transcendent faction's domination over all of China except Inner Mongolia was almost 100% complete. Xinjiang, Qinghai, Gansu, Yunnan, Guizhou, Guangxi, all provinces and districts had fallen to the transcendent faction under the fierce assault of Shangguan Bing Shui and her leadership over 40% of the Blood Spear Legion, 50% of the Blood Whip Legion, and 50% of the Blood Sword Legion, leaving the rest to protect the bases of the already previously controlled territory. In a building in the largest base in all of Qinghai Province, Shangguan Bing Shui and Shangguan Xinyue had just arrived at the base riding a combat helicopter. Both were no different from goddesses as they walked through the streets of the base in the direction of the government building, but even though all the men wanted to get closer, neither dared to take the slightest step forward as they felt every single cell in their bodies crying danger. As they entered into a spacious room, the sight of Wu Yijun immersed in paperwork greeted the two women. Too much work? Hearing her good sister's voice, Wu Yijun smiled slightly and her eyes sparkled with joy as she put what she was doing aside. When Wu Yijun looked up from the papers and her black eyes met Shangguan Bing Shui's blue eyes, the two shared a moment of silence during which they communicated solely through their gaze. Congratulations, Bing Shui. You have succeeded in making our faction the most powerful faction in all of China, just as you promised. Wu Yijun heartily praised, you are truly amazing. To say that Bai Zemin had built the vehicle and Shangguan Bing Shui had driven it was not wrong when it came to the transcendent faction's current achievement. While it was true that building a terrifying and abnormally firm base was harder than anything else, building on such a base still required a lot of effort. Bai Zemin had built the base and had also raised some wall, however, everyone agreed that the one who had laid more stone blocks during the raising of the skyscraper was Shangguan Bing Shui. Only among humans though. Shangguan Bing Shui smiled back at her and sat down beside her before taking her hand, and saying softly, besides, none of this could have been accomplished without you. Don't you think I'm right, Nature Queen Wu Yijun? I don't want to hear name-calling from you, Bloody Queen Shangguan Bing Shui. Wu Yijun rolled her eyes before both friends giggled to each other. Shangguan Xinyue silently watched the practically overflowing joy of both girls. Her lips curved upward slightly at the sight of her daughter's smiling face and her sky-colored eyes flashed with boundless maternal affection. As a single mother, Shangguan Xinyue knew how difficult her life had been for the past 22 years. However, she never once complained and definitely did not plan to do it now. She loved Shangguan Bing Shui with every cell of her existence, and seeing her daughter finally being able to smile like any normal girl even though the world had stopped being normal a year ago was certainly very gratifying to her as a mother. Moreover, Shangguan Xinyue knew that at least 70% of the reason behind that smile was that young man who was currently far away fighting in the north to take the last missing piece of land. I can't wait to have some time to sit and chat with the little king. She found this very funny and couldn't help but chuckle, drawing the attention of the two girls. Ah, Aunt Xinyue. Wu Yijun stood up and bowed her head slightly. I'm glad to see you're well. Girl, this old lady is for better or worse a level 157 soul evolver, you know? It will be hard for me to be bad even if I wanted to. Shangguan Xinyue smiled in response as she looked at Wu Yijun's chest area. Her eyes glistened strangely and her voice was even stranger as she slowly said, then again, are those two still getting bigger? Still getting bigger? Wu Yijun didn't understand right away what she meant, but when she noticed where Shangguan Xinyue's eyes were looking at Wu Yijun finally realized what was going on, and couldn't help but blush slightly. Aunt, you. Shangguan Xinyue sighed dramatically and cupped her small breasts with both hands as she said with feigned Sadness, it seems like everything that was good around here went to my little daughter when I gave birth to her. Although come to think of it, when I was breastfeeding Bing Shui, these two little ones were at least twice as big. Shall I give birth to a new child? Mom, you. Both Wu Yijun and Shangguan Bing Shui were speechless when they saw the naughty cat smile on Shangguan Xingyue's face. Shangguan Xingyue chuckled and put the jokes aside as she took a seat. So, what's left for that child to become the next and hopefully the last king of China? She asked as she looked at the two young girls. Bai Zemin becoming the next king of China was inevitable in Shangguan Xingyue's eyes. It would happen regardless of how many objected. No one could stop him now that he had not only become so powerful but had cleverly forged a deep friendship with a group of talents impossible to describe. As to whether or not he would be able to keep his throne for a lifetime, only the future would tell. Shangguan Xingyue hoped that would be the case, since this would mean that all of them who had helped him not a little to reach that position would also be able to continue living comfortably and without so much hassle. Most of the humans from all over China are now part of our faction, Shangguan Bing Shui pointed out with a serious expression. She continued, only two things are missing for the sole record to consider China as a unified country under the same flag. One of those things is that Bai Zemin needs to take control over most of the human survivors who were in Inner Mongolia when the apocalypse began. Taking advantage of her friend's pause, Wu Yijun added, as for the second and final requirement, that would be to have sufficient control over the various captured bases in such a way that the sole record identifies the leader of those bases as unique and undisputed. I see. Which means that the second and final requirement could be short or long, and the one who has the power this time is you, isn't it, girl? Shangguan Xingyue rested her chin on her palm as she rested her elbow on the wooden table, and a Cheshire cat-like smile appeared on her face as she said softly, be sure to charge this favor to our little king. Wu Yijun blushed prettily as she heard her words. She surprised Shangguan Bing Shui a little when she did not refute anything Shangguan Xingyue said, but instead took a deep breath and nodded confidently. Half a month. In half a month from now on, the second requirement should be completed. Wu Yijun looked at all the papers on the table and said in a firm voice, there are only 7 provinces to go. I will do whatever I have to do to make the over 19 bases fall firmly into his hands within 2 weeks no matter what. Chapter 962 Absolute Frozen Domain Earring. While Shangguan Bing Shui was busy leading the army and Wu Yijun was in charge of asserting the faction's rule in the south/southeastern part of the country, Bai Zemin naturally did not spend the entire month and a half resting and enjoying himself. No. In fact, even if he wanted to lie back and watch the show eating popcorn, it was not possible given the circumstances he was in. True to his word, 5 days after all the members of the Transcendent faction stationed in Inner Mongolia except Kong Jun gathered at the Mother Fortress, Bai Zemin led the troops in a northeasterly direction. The target they were aiming at was a goblin base, again. In fact, according to what Xian Mayer had said, most of the enemy alliance bases were populated by goblins. However, after thinking about it a little better, they all realized that it was nothing surprising considering that goblins reproduced hundreds of times faster than humans, so it made sense that they would take up more space. Their numbers were bigger after all. The only thing that kept the goblins from dominating the world was the fact that the talent of 99% of them was pitifully low, as those capable of breaking beyond the unclassified stage were the vast minority. When Bai Zemin and his team of over 30,000 soul evolvers were approximately 60 kilometers away from the enemy base, however, they were ambushed by a series of explosive traps that held them back for 2 full days before. With the efforts of a small team of 19 soul evolvers with the skill magical explosives detector, they were able to break through to their initial target. Magic explosives were a kind of item that could be created by magic engineers. They were relatively easy to make after understanding the theory behind them, but this did not mean that the power of these small items was low. A single one might not be a big deal, but if a second-order soul evolver was caught in a blast of 10 or more magical explosives, they would certainly become an incinerated corpse. Upon arriving at the Goblin base, the troops of the Transcendent faction belonging to the Blood Spear Legion and the Blood Whip Legion were met with a transcendental amount of resistance, as ironic as it may sound. They fought not only against goblins, but there were also human troops stationed on top of the walls firing heavy machine guns capable of turning the body of a first-order soul evolver into a paste of pierced meat. There were also some battle tanks and 10 assault helicopters and around 20,000 soul evolvers of the human race. However, Xietain showed no mercy to the other side regardless of whether they were goblins or humans. He did not allow his men to show mercy either, and after about 2 days and 1 night of warfare, the cornered enemy finally decided to surrender. It was precisely at that moment, when the enemy surrendered, that Xietain gave one of the cruelest, ruthless, heartless, and to some extent craziest orders he had ever given and would give in the future to come. Leader, the enemy is surrendering. Fu Xietain sighed in relief as he watched the little over 30,000 soldiers and 2,000 soul evolvers throw their weapons beyond the base walls as they knelt down on their knees. Now we just have to take care of the remaining goblins, and victory will be ours. Kong Lan smiled slightly with a poisonous haze around her body. However, even after several seconds, Xietain did not give the order to apprehend the surrendering enemies and imprison them to avoid being stabbed in the back. Leader? Nangongyi looked at Xietain in confusion. Xietain looked at the surrendering humans in the distance, and his blood-red eyes flashed as he said in a cold voice, "We do not accept surrender from anyone." At first, no one understood what he meant. But his next words were far clearer. "Kill them all until there is no one left alive. Be it dog, cat, goblin, or human. None of it matters. Leader Bai, please reconsider your order. They are our compatriots. They were just following orders just like us." Of course, Xietan's order was not very well received, considering that among the enemies there were many innocent people who did nothing wrong and were just following orders from the person who fed them. Seeing that even Nangongyi, Nangong Lingxin, Fu Xietain, and some other people close to him were hesitating, Xietain closed his eyes for a moment, and by the time he opened them again the only thing left in his gaze was indifference. His order was indeed too cruel. It was not fair that others should bear on their conscience the death of those who were surrendering. Therefore, he decided to bear it all alone. Under the terrified eyes of allies and enemies alike, the bodies of the goblins and humans on the opposite side of them began to puff up before exploding into a mass of multicolored bloody mist. The total number of enemies had been about 30 million at the beginning of the war. Although this was a large number, to Xietain it was not a number he needed to fear. He could have wiped them all out in a matter of hours or even minutes if he gave it his all. However, he did not dare to expend his energies so casually. After all, Xietain was now aware that there was a terrifying enemy that might be watching from the shadows and waiting for the perfect moment to attack him at his slightest sign of weakness. As he slaughtered indiscriminately with an expression as cold as ice, Xietain felt 2 gusts of wind rush past him, and in just an instant there were 2 people on his side who began slaughtering both goblins and humans alike. Kai Jingyi's 2 daggers were no different from the Reaper's call in her hands. Her movements were fluid as water and free as the wind but deadly as fire. With a small magic wand in her left hand and a sword in her right hand, Xia used some magic skills to suck the life energy of the enemies around her while her right arm turned into a blur, and for every swing of her sword a head flew into the air. Xietain looked at the 2 women and calmly said, "You 2 don't need to do this. Just ignore my previous order." "I understand." "No," Kai Jingyi yelled, greatly surprising everyone. She did a full spin and slit the throats of the 7 nearby enemies, before pausing for a moment as she looked at Fu Xietain and the rest with fury very rarely seen on her face. "You all keep letting Xietain carry everything. Since the beginning it's been like this. And you, Fu Xietain, are you still the same coward who didn't dare to kill those pieces of trash at the university? Open your eyes once and for all." Kai Jingyi was usually calm, playful, and even a little mischievous. Seeing and hearing her outburst, everyone froze in fright for a moment before different reactions showed on the faces of everyone present. Fu Xiefeng clenched his fists in anger and bit his lip so hard that his teeth drew blood. Without saying anything, he slashed forward with his dagger, and a flash of bright blue lightning turned the body of a human soul evolver into ashes. Immediately after that, he lunged forward and began to slaughter without showing mercy despite the troubled expression on his face. Kong Lan and all the others sighed in their hearts, but in the end, they all began to kill even though they knew it was not exactly the right thing to do. Kai Jingyi's words had a great effect on them, especially on those who had been with Bai Zemin since the beginning of this new era. He always carried the worst things, they knew that. Therefore, now they wanted to help him a little to lighten the weight that weighed on his heart like a 1,000-ton rock. As for Xia, I don't understand why you guys are making such a fuss. Just kill and be done with it, for God's sake. She rolled her eyes and said casually while killing dozens per blink, we just have to follow the leader, don't make things so complicated when they're not. Despite being highly respected not only because of the number of lives her skills had saved and her terrifying power that allowed her to somehow link to Bai Zemin's records, Xia was not particularly looked upon favorably in the faction by the other higher-ups except for a small number of them. This was due to her personality. In her eyes, everyone was replaceable except Bai Zemin. That's how important he was to her. He was basically her ladder to heaven. And if he fell, she would never be able to get very far compared to where she could have gone. After wiping out every existing life inside and outside the first enemy base, the news that the troops of the Transcendent faction was not sparing anyone regardless of whether they surrendered or not reached Liang Peng's ears, and although he tried his best to suppress that information, it was not so easy as one of the officers who was in the room during the meeting in which this fact became known leaked it whether by accident or not. Fortunately for him, although there was some chaos among the survivors, the soldiers and soul evolvers reacted with burning fury towards the Transcendent faction, especially towards Bai Zemin, whom they began to call Blood Tyrant for his acts of cruelty. This caused the pressure on Bai Zemin and his group to grow immensely as the enemy would now be fighting to the death. However, no matter how hard they tried, the enemy bases continued to fall one after another as time passed. After taking down the first base, besides the mother fortress, Bai Zemin and his team faced the terrifying army of the third Prince Xian again. The sea beasts teamed up with the goblins and humans to defend and attack in the process. Now facing at least 200 million enemies because of Xian, Bai Zemin's progress naturally slowed down. However, slowing down did not mean stopping. He led his group to victory after victory as they cornered the enemy, pushing them further and further back as they took base after base. A month after leaving behind the mother fortress with half the army to defend it. During this month, several of Bai Zemin's titles had been modified as the bases of each subdistrict and district were finally recognized by the Soul Record as limbs of the Transcendent faction. Like his title ruler of Beijing, Bai Zemin received other titles such as ruler of Shaanxi, ruler of Jiangsu, ruler of Shanghai, and some more. Aside from fighting and leading the army, Bai Zemin spent much of his time alone in the collector's pocket world. With great effort and after 3 full weeks in the outside world's time, he had finally finished the creation of the earring he had started earlier with the intention of attaching the feather of the frozen end to it. 3 weeks in the outside world meant 21 days, but in the collector's pocket world 21 days of the outside world meant 210 days. In short, Bai Zemin had spent more than half a year packed with failures and products he was not satisfied with, to finally be able to forge the perfect earring. While everyone was resting after taking down the enemy's second-to-last base, Bai Zemin entered the collector's pocket world alone. He walked towards the house and headed straight to the basement when he was suddenly greeted by a girl's emotionless voice. "Bullet, I finished my part." Looking toward a corner of the basement, Bai Zemin found the figure of Callie sitting in her wheelchair. She was slightly paler than usual, but Bai Zemin could have sworn he was seeing a faint smile on her dry lips. She pointed toward the work table and said clearly trying to stay calm, "Look for yourself." Xietain walked over to the work table and looked at the elegant earring for a moment before gently touching the needle. The records immediately flashed in his eyes. Absolute Frozen Domain Earring. Chapter 963 Anniversary, Falling in Love for the Second Time. When the records of the earring were put before Xietain, he doubted his eyes a little to the point where he rechecked it just in case. It wasn't until after the second time that he finally accepted the truth along with Callie's words. To be honest, when you gave me that rank 5 pendant and asked me to help you draw the best runes I could do, I thought this might happen, she said before falling silent for a couple of seconds and continuing with a sigh. But seeing it in person is really... how can I put it? I admit I'm feeling a little good right now. Probably the same way you felt when you finished the earring forging. After a long silence, Xietain slowly closed his eyes and sighed. I understand you perfectly. When I finished the forging process last week, I felt incredibly happy and proud, not because my blacksmithing skill jumped straight to the 4th order, but because I, who was a nobody not long ago, managed to craft something like that. Even if a big part of the reason Xietain had managed to forge a rank 5 earring was because he had used a legend-grade treasure capable of attaching to a piece of equipment on the item, this didn't make him feel any less proud. It was he who spent over 200 days hammering like crazy. It was he who sweated lakes and spent entire nights without sleep. It was he who used overlap regeneration to the maximum acceptable limit every day to progress a little more. It was he who gritted his teeth and held back all the frustration and powerlessness he felt every time a piece of the earring broke, pushing him to make a new one practically from scratch. It was he who stuck to his initial determination to the bitter end and did not allow himself to be seduced by other earrings, melting them down again until he reached the optimum records he was looking for. Therefore, he understood how Callie felt, because it was she who spent days inside the collector's pocket watch helping him to draw extremely complex runes with great care on the body of the earring. Thanks to his younger sister Ming-Chi, Xietain was aware that Callie had definitely spent a great deal of mental energy on this, to the point where he wouldn't be surprised if she slept for 2 days straight. It was pride that came not only from having created such an amazing object, but it was pride that came from having overcome all obstacles without ever giving up despite countless failures along the trail. Besides, Callie opened her palm and extended it outward as she calmly said, "Something interesting happened when I was done with the earring." Seeing what Callie held in her palm, Xietain couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air at the same time as his eyes flashed with disbelief. That's... he stammered, failing in the process of trying to express his thoughts and feelings with words. "This is only rank 4 though," Callie said with a sigh. "Looks like a legend-grade treasure, couldn't be duplicated after all. Nevertheless, its stats are lower but not bad at all. You should think about what to do with it now, since it clearly doesn't suit your combat style nor skills." Xietain closed his eyes and 2 people came to his mind. This was going to be a somewhat complicated decision for which he would take a bit of time to decide what to do. Before that, however, he had to give away the main gift after all. He stretched his tired body and said in a cheerful voice, "Still, we really made it on time." Callie nodded, "Indeed, just in time." "Deadline. So, you have to go?" After leaving the collector's pocket world, Xietain immediately started looking for Lilith. But he didn't have to look too hard since she was waiting for him right where he had disappeared before. However, what he did not expect was to find Lilith looking at him with such a serious expression on her face, an expression he had rarely seen on her. At first, what Xietain thought was that she was mad at him. After all, he had been keeping her out of the collector's pocket world for the entire last month and hiding things from her, so she might as well be angry at this fact. Little did he expect that the motive was completely different. "I'm afraid so." Lilith nodded with a serious expression on her beautiful face. She frowned and a flash of confusion shone in her ruby eyes as she slowly explained her motives. "About 2 hours ago, the leader of my faction, Lucifer, contacted me and told me to head to the main world of the demonic army as soon as possible. Xietain, this is the first time I heard the ever-lazy and carefree Lucifer being so serious about something. Lucifer had remained relatively calm even when all the factions were attacked by the ghost of the heavenly wolf. Serious back then, even though that day could have meant the end for him and everyone else. Therefore, Lilith was really puzzled as to what was happening. Whatever is happening, I'm afraid it's going to be something big, she added as she looked directly into his eyes sadly. Hopefully, I'll be able to come back soon. I see. Xietain nodded slowly as he tried to accept the undeniable. This news was really affecting him in a negative way. Not only because Lilith would leave for an unknown period of time, but also because of the date she had to leave. However, he knew he could not let her see his sadness. If this was such an important matter, then Xietain hoped that his beloved would be in optimal condition to face and overcome whatever came her way. Therefore, when he raised his head to look at her, Xietain had a mysterious smile on his face. Hey, Lilith. Do you know what day it is today? Today? She blinked in surprise at his sudden question. However, not even a second later something clicked in her and her pupils trembled fiercely as she realized something she had inadvertently overlooked. Xietain realized that she was finally remembering it. No, she hadn't forgotten it to begin with. Sorry. Lilith apologized in panic and said quickly, I swear I didn't forget. It's just that you are used to ignoring the passage of time, and because of your past you now ignore certain events that are actually of great importance. Xietain interrupted her. Lilith opened her eyes wide for a moment and subconsciously nodded in surprise. Why, yeah, I know. Xietain reached out his right hand and caressed her silky smooth cheek affectionately. We'll gradually work together on this, don't worry too much. Right, today was a very special day. Today was a special day for all living beings on Earth, but for Xietain and Lilith it could be said to be even more special. Today could be considered either good or bad depending on each individual's point of view, as well as specific events. Actually, I just finished forging it not long ago, and Callie finished drawing the runes I asked for just today, so it's quite an interesting coincidence. Xietain scratched his head and extended his closed palm forward as he said in a mysterious voice, Lilith, aren't you curious to know the reason why I didn't let you come with me to the collector's pocket world all this time? Lilith looked at his large hand closed in front of her before looking at him with a faint smile. Could it be that you were making a gift for me? Xietain nodded and said softly, it took me a while to forge it. I hope you'll like it. I will definitely like it. Lilith smiled back with eyes filled with affection and opened her palm just below his closed hand. However, both Lilith's smile and expression froze and her pupils contracted to the size of needles a second, after Xietain opened his hand and gently placed the earring on her small white hand. I thought I wouldn't make it in time. Even though there were good results before this one, none of them managed to satisfy me, so I destroyed them and forged again and again. Xietain explained with a slight smile as he looked at Lilith's ruby-colored eyes trembling more and more intensely. Today marks 1 year since we first met. Well, even though it hasn't been a year since we both acknowledged our feelings for each other, I think it's not so bad to consider this day as a kind of anniversary. Xietain smiled warmly at her and said gently, happy first year, and thank you for everything you've done for me so far. Lilith looked at him with the intention of saying something, but this was a mistake on her part, because when she opened her mouth, all that came out was a small, delicate sound similar to the whimpering of a newborn before the dam broke. Xietain was surprised to see 2 clear lines of crystalline tears sliding silently down Lilith's face, but he quickly knew that these were tears of happiness in the midst of the shock she was probably feeling. But he would probably be much more surprised if he knew that the last time Lilith cried was when she lost everything many years ago. She had thought that her tears had run out and dried up completely after crying so much in those days, but life sometimes gave truly unexpected surprises. When she felt Xietan's arms around her, Lilith finally couldn't help but start sobbing like a little girl. Hey! What will those higher existences say if they saw you crying like a baby? Xietain kissed the top of her head as he enjoyed the moment with a warm smile. At the end of the day, Even God didn't know when he would feel the warmth of the woman in his arms again. After a long, long time, Lilith was finally able to stop crying. However, the chest area of Baizemen's shirt was soaked with her tears. It wasn't as if he was complaining, of course. Perhaps not wanting him to see her face at this moment, Lilith whispered softly with her face still buried in his chest, "Stupid Zemen, do you have any idea how valuable this gift is? If you talk about physical value and not emotional, I'll get really mad at you," said Baizemen, half joking, half serious, while caressing her back tenderly. "In this kind of situation you have to accept the gift even if it is a pretty stone but without any real value or use. That's how it works." A few seconds later, Lilith nodded obediently like a little wife. "Okay." 2 or 3 minutes later, she slowly raised her head to look him in the eyes. And when Baizemen saw her expression, he could do nothing against his heart as it began to beat louder and louder. Her cheeks were slightly flushed, her ruby eyes moist. A few teardrops glistened like precious crystals hanging from her long eyelashes, and a look in her eyes would be noted by even the most inexperienced in the field as the look of a woman madly in love. This was the first time Baizemen had seen this kind of expression on her, and somehow he couldn't help but think that this was the meaning of innocence itself, even though the one who had such an innocent and pure expression was a succubus whose charm could arouse the lust of any living being in the universe. Could someone fall in love twice at the same time with the same person? If anyone ever asked Baizemen such a question before, he would probably have said no. After all, love was the ultimate form of affection. After all, love was the strongest romantic emotion. How could one feel love twice at the same time for the same living being? However, if someone were to ask him this very question at this very moment, his answer would be that yes, someone could fall in love with another someone 2 times in such a way that said love would grow to a whole new magnitude in which even the life of that first someone would be firmly tied to the fate of their loved one. Chapter 964 Lucifer learns a secret. Baizemen didn't fight his impulses, he didn't have to. Lilith also didn't do anything opposite to what he wanted to do, quite the contrary in fact. Seeing him lower his head with his eyes fixed on her full red lips, she closed her eyes like a little girl waiting for the kiss of her most loved one. The kiss they both shared was not lustful at all. There was nothing of messy tongues curling around each other. There was no exchange of drool in large quantities to the point of running down the chin. It was not one of those kisses where the couple wanted nothing more than to devour their partner to satisfy the heat of their bodies, but it was a very soft and surprisingly chaste kiss. They both felt each other's lips for a few seconds before Baizemen pecked Lilith's again. He gently pressed his forehead to hers and looked closely into her eyes as he whispered softly, "I love you a lot." Lilith's eyes softened as she looked at him silently for a few seconds. She wished she could look at him like that for all eternity. Any sentient being regardless of gender would always appreciate words of love from their most loved one even if they already knew how they felt, and Lilith was no different in this regard. Unfortunately, she was unable to immerse herself in the moment as she would truly like to, since time at this moment time was an enemy and not an ally. "I love you too, a lot," Lilith whispered back as she slowly closed her eyes. Being aware of her difficulties, Baizemen preferred to move back himself rather than be a bit selfish and hold her close for longer. "Go," he said as he looked at her with a faint smile. "I'll wait for you here on Earth, but make sure not to take too long." Lilith looked at him with unwilling eyes but said nothing to renege against his words. She was not a little kid, she was a grown woman who knew she had neither the power nor the ability to decide on destiny, and who was aware that some things were inevitable. She had it more than clear. She had learned the hard way over the years after all. "Zemen, sorry. I can't give you anything as a present," Lilith lamented as she bit her lip hard. Because she was a higher existence, she was not allowed to do anything great that would affect a lower existence directly. She couldn't take the initiative to attack to hurt a lower existence directly, but she also couldn't give them treasures or any items that would serve to increase their power. She was already playing with her luck, walking on the thin line of the soul record ever since she met Baizemen. "But you gifted me with something so Even though she didn't finish her words, Xietain knew what she wanted to say. He gently poked the center of her forehead with the tip of his index finger and said in a slightly serious voice, "As I said before, this is not about physical value. I would prefer that you value the earring I gave you not for its power and value on a universal level, but for the amount of effort I put into forging it for you." After a moment of silence, Lilith finally nodded as she realized he was right. Xietain, her beloved, had spent over half a year alone working on this earring for her. "Besides, you'll repay me later for all the gifts you'll owe me." Xietain smiled mischievously as he took a step back and looked at the body of the woman in front of him with wolf-like eyes. Lilith couldn't help but laugh a little amused, and with the mood now a little lighter thanks to what he had just said, she took a step forward and stood on her tiptoes to give him a quick lick on the lips before stepping back just as quickly as she moved on. "Thank you for the gift, Daddy Xietain," she said in a little girl's voice. Xietain cleared his throat as he felt a certain fire begin to ignite in him, making Lilith laugh out loud. Minutes later, Xietain was alone in his tent as he stared at the empty place in front of him with a complicated expression on his face. No more smiles or laughter, there was just a lot of sadness amidst the anger that bubbled constantly in his blood-red eyes. He let out a heavy sigh as he scratched his head and muttered to himself, "That little bastard Lucifer couldn't have at least waited a few more days? Look what you've done now, ruining everything like this." Just as Xietain complained, the ground began to rumble and the next moment he heard several explosions coming from a distance, followed by the immediate activation of alarm-like skills along with the warning cries of his faction members. The enemy was attacking. Xietan's eyes flashed with frustration and ferocity as he ran out of his tent with gritted teeth. At least now he would have a place to unleash all his anger, sadness, and frustration. His enemies could only blame themselves for choosing a bad time to come. Before leaving, Lilith made a stop in the tent of Callie, which was only a few meters apart from Xietan's tent. When she found the little girl sitting in her wheelchair like a lifeless porcelain doll, she didn't say anything right away but observed her in silence for a full minute before breaking the silence. "Thank you for not saying anything." Callie raised her head slightly, and though her eyes were delicately closed, her face looked exactly where Lilith was standing. "I might change my mind, who knows?" she replied in an emotionless voice. Lilith let out some air through her nose in the form of a snort along with a slight smile at the corner of her lips. "I didn't know you had one of those personalities that say no but in reality mean yes. What do you call these people? Sundara?" "I think that's what that little scoundrel calls them." That little scoundrel was confined in a world alone for over 200 days, working practically without sleep. At the same time, he was dealing with the ongoing war to make you a gift with his own hands. Callie pointed out, without arguing against Lilith regarding her personality. Lilith's eyes softened and she said in a gentle voice, He gave me the earring a few minutes ago. Even though he's a little scoundrel, isn't he the best? Maybe. I guess you're right." Callie nodded and said calmly, "Be careful or someone might take him away from you." "That won't happen." Lilith shook her head, still smiling calmly. "Regardless of anything and everything that might happen, I will be his number one and priority always." Xietain is not only very powerful and talented but also has a really charming personality that attracts the opposite sex by nature. Even I have noticed this despite being this young, not to mention other people. But you sound very confident despite knowing that you have rivals who can be around him at all times and in ways that you can't. Callie pointed out with no change in her tone of voice. Lilith looked at her for a few seconds and asked with a smile, "Little monster, let me ask you something." Callie waited in noncommittal silence, but Lilith's question certainly caught her off guard. "Do you think there is anyone better than you when it comes to runes?" Even after a long time, Callie said nothing. However, Lilith didn't need to hear a verbal answer because she knew what Callie was thinking. Chuckling, Lilith pointed out, "That's just the way it is." Surprisingly, the corner of Callie's dry lips moved slightly upward as she heard Lilith's words and finally understood what she was doing. Just as Callie didn't believe there was anyone better than her when it came to runes, Lilith was telling her without words that she didn't believe there was any woman capable of taking her man away from her. Well, only time will tell. Callie shrugged without lingering too long on the subject. Take care of him for me in my absence, Lilith said. But before her body completely disappeared, she managed to hear Callie's reply. Don't worry, I'm sure many people will want to take care of him in your absence. Lilith chuckled to herself, and a moment later she was out of the Earth's atmosphere. The smile on her face slowly receded and her eyes filled with reluctance as she stared at the bright blue planet in front of her before sighing and darting off into the distance as she used the little spatial knowledge she had to move faster than her agility would normally allow. Only a few minutes after disappearing, Lilith returned once more and looked around with a frown as if searching for something. Finally, she shook her head and left, except that this time she didn't come back. Approximately 40 minutes later, a crack even darker than space itself seemed to tear through the area as a figure wearing pajamas walked out from within. Lucifer looked at where Lilith had departed to before looking at where she had first appeared. The expression on his face was not lazy, but rather there was a slight frown on his handsome face that helped to further emphasize the sharpness of his eyes. I knew there was something rotten that day because of her reaction. But I didn't expect this at all, he muttered in the middle of nowhere. That day when God launched a sudden attack as a joke towards Lilith, she became frenetic beyond description even though his attack had not even touched her. Lucifer had not given it much thought in the moment, but as time passed he began to realize that something was not right. However, as Lucifer stared at the empty space in front of him, the frown on his face deepened. He could see nothing, there was nothing there. But, he was sure of one thing. The bloody succubus definitely flew out of here as if passing through a portal. Lucifer scratched his neck as he tried to find answers to the mystery in front of him. Although he came and went through the area Lilith had passed through before, Lucifer simply found himself flying through space normally and without any kind of disturbance. He even launched a few soft attacks to see if he found anything strange, but nothing out of the ordinary happened. However, despite not being able to get any deeper, Lucifer was not disappointed as he was now one step closer to the truth. I'm glad I didn't send Fire Sorrow here. He shook his head and waved his right hand, making a crack of darkness open up next to him. Just as he stepped into the crack and looked back, just a second before disappearing, he said under his breath, or else that girl might go crazy, and I need her to the max for what's coming. Seconds later, the crack closed completely and outer space became calm once again. At the same time, the beautiful bright blue planet that Lucifer could not see but somehow suspected was there, continued its rotation with no change at all. Chapter 965 Cosmic Particle Cannon. The war in the north part of China appeared to be ending with the victory of the Transcendent faction. However, appearances were just that, appearances. Despite constantly pushing the enemy alliance steadily and step by step backwards, victory still seemed to be far from the sight of the group led by Xietain. As Xian Mayer suspected, the number of enemy bases was more than she knew. However, even then, the power of the Transcendent faction and its soul evolvers, with particularly pure soul power and above-average technology, managed to be enough for all enemy bases to fall in just 1.5 months. All except one, to be precise. The last bastion was the human bastion, the base of the faction led by Liangpeng. All the other goblin-led bases had fallen, and regardless of whether it was human or not, all living beings inside and outside that base were slaughtered mercilessly by Xietan's troops. Approximately 400 kilometers away from the last enemy base, the Transcendent faction was fighting fiercely against what seemed to be an infinite number of enemies. Although during the last month and a half, the Transcendent faction had wiped out no less than 1 billion enemies, the truth was that nothing seemed to be comparable to what was in front of them. Even after half a month of war, the number of enemies was still massive to the point that only now the distant walls of the base over 70 kilometers away were beginning to be vaguely visible to soul evolvers with eye or sense-enhancing skills thanks to the wall's height of hundreds of meters. However, despite the fact that they had already managed to push through with great difficulty for approximately 330 kilometers after killing no less than 3 billion lives. The reality was that if things continued like this, the losers would be them and not the enemy, who could do nothing but retreat in the face of the seemingly unstoppable power of Baizemin's faction. At the front of the army, Baizemin was using his skill, blood manipulation, in such a way that about 100 thick blood chains swung around him like tentacles. Each chain was as thick as a tree trunk and some were as long as 100 meters, which meant that each swing not only caused the direct death of thousands of enemies, but also shook the ground with such ferocity that the shockwave was responsible of turning the bodies of thousands of others into meat paste. Despite the fact that everything seemed to be under control, Baizemin was frowning slightly as he looked back with a tinge of worry. Fu Xiefeng and the rest were all third-order soul evolvers. Even Luo Ning had advanced last week to the third order after completing the last remaining requirement to fulfill her advancement. Each of them had plenty of ability to take on armies of hundreds of thousands without too much trouble. The most powerful ones could even wipe out armies of a few million if they gave their all. However, although the difference in individual power was so great that the numbers seemed insignificant, the reality was completely different. Having fought for half a month without even an hour's sleep as the enemy had surrounded them, having been on high alert for so long with no time to relax in the face of the sharp claws and skills of countless sea beasts and millions of goblins, they had all long since reached rock bottom. During the past month and a half, Baizemin had only lost just over 100 men during the capture of more than 13 enemy bases. However, in just half a month since he and his group had set foot on ground 400 kilometers south of the last enemy stronghold, the number of losses that had previously numbered only 100 had risen to over 14,000 men, including 3,000 soul evolvers. Even if Baizemin was reserving most of his mana and stamina in case that terrifying enemy appeared, he was still Baizemin, an anomaly identified as such by the soul record, ruler of the universe. Even with his presence, however, he could not help but lose men on the battlefield. This was, without a doubt, the greatest loss the Transcendent faction had suffered with Baizemin personally leading them. Moreover, that number would not stop increasing at all but would continue to grow faster and faster with each passing second as the enemy commanders used their troops as cannon fodder to drain the stamina and mana of the already worn-out men of the Transcendent faction. Under normal circumstances, all of them should have been dried up and unable to fight by now, especially the low-level soldiers. However, it was thanks to Xiaya's existence that despite the bad situation they could still continue to fight. However, even she was starting to run out of steam faster than she would like. Keeping her wolf's pack skill active to link Baizemin's records with tens of thousands of living beings was more exhausting than one might think. But Xiaya knew that if not for that 30% of stats she was able to borrow from Baizemin to share with everyone, else the faction would collapse. Therefore, she gritted her teeth and persisted as she killed all the enemies around her like a cornered beast. Her eyes, like everyone else's eyes, were bloodshot not only from exhaustion but also from the amount of lives she had taken. The smell of blood and rotting flesh was overwhelming, but after so much killing none of them thought of anything but killing whatever was in front of them. I need to do something quickly or else everyone but me will end up dead. Baizemin's expression was serious as he continued to slaughter enemies using blood magic attacks and physical attacks with annihilation of the falling sky turned into an elegant golden bow. His right hand became a blur as more than 4,000 fire arrows per second broke forward and ended the lives of tens of thousands after hitting one and exploding powerfully. Despite his high speed of massacre, however, it was far from enough. Being aware of this fact, Baizemin gave the order to deploy the 200 goblin airships that were on standby 100 kilometers to the rear, and several minutes later he could hear the fierce explosions of the main magic cannons and secondary weapons of the airships causing a disaster in the enemy horde that was blocking the retreat. What made him sigh in relief was that although the sea creatures had several ranged attack skills, These skills only had a range of 400 to 500 meters when it came to defying the Earth's gravity before exploding and disintegrating from the pressure or simply plummeting back to dry land. The Earth shook fiercely and the sky began to rumble softly as more and more sea beasts were torn apart. Blood of different colors, pieces of flesh, broken limbs, broken bones, fish scales, teeth. The already terrifying battlefield became even more terrifying as at least 100,000 more enemies began to fall. For every second, thanks to the power of the 200 airships that fired without reserve, rapidly draining the power within the soul stones as if they didn't care about being wasteful. The power of the airships capable of killing even third-order soul evolvers was no small thing. The unclassified and first-order beasts fell easier than flies under the power of the cannons and shockwaves, resulting from each explosion after the impact. However, the relief of Xietain and the others did not last more than a few seconds when from the distant horizon more than 300 goblin airships and 100 attack helicopters rose into the sky in a menacing manner. Soon, the airships controlled by men of the Transcendent faction began to exchange fire against the enemy airships while trying to make evasive movements in a short-lived attempt to avoid being hit by their counterparts' weapons. Occasionally, there would be one or two airships on one or both sides that would explode into fireballs before falling to the ground and exploding, taking the lives of tens of thousands of goblins and sea beasts in the process after being blasted by the magic cannons of one or more enemy airships. Without the support of the airships, the pressure that had been taken off the human troops fighting on the ground against the endless sea of enemies came back stronger than ever, and little by little, even the most powerful began to receive more and more wounds on their bodies. Wounds that despite being light would turn into big problems as they piled up more and more. The situation had only worsened a day later, and the number of Allied casualties had risen to almost 20,000 men from the previous 14,000 during the last 24 hours. In fact, apart from Xietain and Xietain, there were 4 other reasons why the Transcendent faction was still standing firm in this war. One of those reasons was Kong Lan. She, with her constant healing, had become a goddess in the eyes of all the warriors present. Another reason was the existence of Nangong Lingxin. She alone could hold back nearly 1 million enemies like an impenetrable wall with her fourth-order energy barrier skill, not letting them advance at all and buying some time for several allies to at least breathe a sigh of relief. The third reason they could still hold their ground was Xian Meier along with her 2 third-order Triton bodyguards. At Xietan's request, Xian Meier let herself go completely and each of her magic attacks was vicious enough to turn at least 50,000 enemies into meat pulp as dozens of flood dragons surrounded by golden lightning sprayed thunderbolts towards the enemy ranks constantly. The last, but probably the most important reason of the 4 was the existence of Father. Xietain was forced to snap out of his inner thoughts as he was trying to find countermeasures to counter the current situation when he heard Bai Shirleen's urgent voice. All the anger he had been holding back seemed to erupt like a fiery volcano when looking to his right he saw Bai Shirleen being forced back step by a third-order goblin who using some camouflage skill had managed to sneak towards her. Bai Shirleen had tears at the edge of her eyes that she was fighting against to keep them from falling. Her face was pale and her small fists were shaking as she punched almost without strength due to exhaustion, barely being able to hold off the swift attacks of the fully rested, cunning goblin who believed she had made a good choice in attacking the most terrifying soul evolver of all those showing signs of heavy fatigue. In the sky, standing on the head of a flood dragon cloaked in golden lightning armor, Xian Meier pointed her index finger in the direction of the third-order goblin with the intention of helping the troubled girl. However, she stopped as a frightening aura covered her, and with a pale face, she quickly controlled her skill to make the flood dragon soar beyond the clouds. Boom! The flood dragon exploded into millions of electric sparks after being hit by a bright red laser beam, and as Xian Meier fell from the sky with a blood stain at the corner of her mouth, She saw what appeared to be a huge red on top of the wall of the distant base slowly go out as the clouds in the sky exploded outwards after being hit by something moving too fast. However, Xietain Mayer recognized what that object was. It was just that she could not believe it, even though in her heart she knew the truth. Cosmic particle cannon? The cosmic particle cannon was a lost technology that had been found thousands of years ago by other rulers of the sea. Its destructive power was, in fact, barely below that of a nuclear bomb. However, its capacity to travel at January 10th the speed of light made it a far more lethal weapon. 1 out of 10 part of the speed of light might seem small to many, but the truth was that only 1/10 of the speed of light was more than enough to put even some higher existences to shame. Chapter 966 Feng Tianwu, Daughter of Agni. These cosmic particle cannons were part of the main defenses of the East Sea royal family's castle, and there were only 20 of them. Xietain Mayer couldn't believe that her brother, the third Prince Xiankuan, actually brought one of those cannons to the mainland, and what she found even harder to believe was that her father had probably allowed him to do so, even though each cannon had a clear lifetime limit. Why did he bring a cosmic particle cannon to the mainland? Xietain Mayer gritted her teeth in anger and disbelief at the same time as Xiao Xiao controlled a wave of water to prevent her fall. Things had become a lot more difficult now. Even if they managed to defeat her brother, the third prince's army, the power of the cosmic particle cannon was more than capable of ending the life of anyone present with a single shot. Boom! Attracted by a terrifying explosion from the ground, Xietain Mayer quickly looked down just in time to see the body of the Third Order goblin exploding into a mist of blood. Even from high in the sky, Xietain Mayer could feel Bai Zemin's murderous intent slowly beginning to get out of control as the blurred ghost of a blood-red wolf appeared behind him as he slowly withdrew his fist. It was then that she realized that this great bloody war would soon come to an end. As for whether they would end up being victorious or defeated, Xietain Mayer did not know. However, not knowing was good. It meant that she had sufficient confidence in the young human man's power that she had not given up all hope. As the thick blood chains now waved more ferociously than before, practically turning into dozens of crimson flashes with minor golden tints and taking the lives of over 70,000 enemies per second, Bai Zemin updated the count of Third Order soul evolvers he needed to kill to complete his evolution requirement to 5 pending. My dear Sherlin, are you all right? He asked worriedly but with cold eyes as he looked at the endless flood of enemies that kept coming from everywhere as if they were endless microbes. Father, Sherlin is really tired. The girl muttered, panting and feeling like crying. She didn't want to cry because she was a big girl and didn't want to embarrass herself in front of the person she admired the most in the whole world. But this whole situation was too much for Bai Sherlin to bear, so she was on the verge of collapsing. Can Sherlin hold on for a few more minutes? Bai Zemin asked as he stared straight ahead. Father will finish off the bad guys in an instant and then we can go to sleep, how about it? The idea of sleep was really appealing to Bai Sherlin after not having slept at all for 15 days. Her beautiful black eyes half closed as a result of physical, mental, and spiritual exhaustion glistened slightly as she asked softly, can we sleep with Bing Shui Mommy? Lilith Mom has left and is still not coming back. Of course. Bai Zemin nodded. He had no choice but to tell a white lie at this point. Just a few more minutes and then we can sleep. Father will look for Bing Shui Mommy so Sherlin can hug us both, how about it? That was all that was needed. Sherlin will fight. The girl nodded vigorously, and as if her energies had returned, she rushed forward. Each of her fists caused terrifying explosions, and the shockwaves from each punch turned thousands of enemies into flesh pulp at the same time. Ice swords began to rain down from the sky as Bai Sherlin, like everyone else, began to drink mana recovery potions. Unfortunately, she had already consumed all the stamina recovery potions she had and had even drunk the ones of some soul evolvers who gave up theirs, aware of the fact that Bai Sherlin's help was higher. However, Bai Zemin was aware that Bai Sherlin was only back for a few minutes, and soon she would not be able to continue like this. This was the awakening after receiving good news before the fall, similar to when a terminal patient seemed to fill up with energy again before closing their eyes permanently. Therefore, he needed to end it all soon. The loss of Bai Shilin would not be small, and the burden on the already worn-out team would increase horribly. It was at this point that Bai Zemin needed the help of the only person capable of covering for him, a person whose capacity for slaughter was even higher than his before he broke loose. The last reason why the Transcendent faction was still standing. Bai Zemin looked into the distance to the east of the battlefield, and all he saw was a raging hell of burning flames covering as far as the eye could see. No matter if it was a mutant beast or goblin, no matter if it was unclassified, first order, or second order, no matter if it was a mage or melee warrior, all living beings several kilometers eastward were reduced to ashes, leaving behind nothing but white bones. Standing alone amidst countless bones, Feng Tianwu held a bright red magic staff while her similarly colored magic robe swayed gently in the presence of the hot wind blowing in from the distance. She alone had taken care of the eastern area for the past 10 hours, and no one, not even her allies, could come close. Bai Zemin did not know how powerful Shangguan Bing Shui was, but even he could not help but doubt whether she could reach such frightening magical power as the one Feng Tianwu had. This was because Bai Zemin could tell that she was holding back, and not a little because of how relaxed she seemed. The only downside was that she was drinking mana recovery potions at thunderous speeds. In the past 10 hours, she had practically consumed 70% of all the mana recovery potions that Bai Zemin had brought with him from Eventide World. However, none of this mattered to Bai Zemin. What mattered to him was her magical power and ability to wipe out hundreds of thousands of enemies in a matter of blinks of an eye. Suddenly, everyone was surprised when their enemies stopped moving. Subconsciously, those who had been with Bai Zemin when they were in the forest and fought against the Weaver ants turned to look at him as they had witnessed a similar scene back then, but on a far smaller scale in comparison. Feng Tianwu also turned to look at him with a confused expression on her face. She did not understand why he was suddenly changing tactics, even though he had told them before that he needed to guard himself to face a powerful enemy that was watching him from the top of the base walls. However, her confusion grew even more when she saw Bai Zemin walking towards her. Although he did not ignore her or treat her rudely, Feng Tianwu somehow felt that he also did not take the initiative to talk to her, nor did he seem to have the intention to be her friend, even though he was willing to be friends with other people. Of course, whether this was just her assumption or not, Feng Tianwu understood that he was well within his rights after what she did to him years ago. At the end of the day, regardless of whether she had changed or not, the past could not be erased. Feng Tianwu, do you think you can hold off all the small enemies by yourself? When he stopped in front of her with an indifferent expression and ice-cold red eyes, Feng Tianwu couldn't help but smile wryly when she heard his question. She had to take back the above. Actually, there were times when Bai Zemin took the initiative to talk to her. It was when it was about something regarding the faction. Basically, work. Will it be over soon? She asked calmly as she stared into his eyes. Unconscious of her thoughts, and with no intention of being aware of them, Bai Zemin nodded. I have that intention. But, I need someone on Bing Shui's level to help me hold the rest of them back during that time. I'm afraid I won't be able to worry about anything other than my enemy. Although Xian Meier had a great magical power, her ability to take out many enemies at the same time or restrain them was insufficient for what Bai Zemin needed at the moment. Hearing Shangguan Bing Shui's name, Feng Tianwu could not help but frown slightly for a moment before regaining her composure, at least on the outside. After thinking about it for a few seconds, she slowly nodded after some hesitation. 5 minutes. 5 minutes is the most I can do. After that, I won't be able to fight anymore even if I want to. There were two things that Feng Tianwu had not said. One was that during those 5 minutes she would probably wipe out the entire enemy army. As for the second thing she did not say, it was related to the reason why despite having that ability she had not used it until now. 5 minutes? That's enough. Bai Zemin nodded with brightened eyes. In fact, 5 minutes was more than he expected to get. He would be done with everything in much less time, for better or worse, and regardless of the consequences. Very well then. Feng Tianwu nodded calmly, and after looking at him for a moment, she walked past him in the direction of the front of the exhausted faction members who took this moment to rest and be healed despite being able to easily attack the paralyzed enemy. Feng Tianwu looked at the endless sea of enemies before she glanced at Bai Zemin out of the corner of her eye, for a moment. Finally, she closed her eyes and let out a sigh. When Feng Tianwu opened her eyes again, the only thing in them was resolve as she chanted with a hint of pride and something else that was hard to comprehend, Daughter of Agni. You have activated the 6th order level 5 unique skill Daughter of Agni. You have learned during the temporary period of 5 hours the skills Firemaker Fire Manipulation. Magical power is increased by 300% for 30 minutes, and the cooldown of all fire-type skills gets reduced to half. During the 2-month cooldown of the skill Daughter of Agni, all your magical power, mana, and magic will be reduced to 1. You possess creation, control, and the right. You can now use EX skill Domain of the God of Fire Agni for a maximum of 5 minutes. The current maximum range of Domain of the God of Fire Agni is 500 kilometers due to your lack of magical power. I guess this might be a better apology than a verbal one. Feng Tianwu muttered in a voice that only she could hear. She looked at the enemies with her slightly crimson-colored eyes similar to a bright flame as she said in a resolute voice, Domain of the God of Fire Agni. Feng Tianwu's voice had barely fallen when a new message flashed across her retina, one that contained the reason why she had never counted on this skill, despite having it since she obtained her class Daughter of Agni when she turned into a 3rd order existence. Chapter 967, Taking the Cosmic Particle Cannon. When the words Domain of the God of Fire Agni left Feng Tianwu's lips, the whole world seemed to freeze for a brief moment, as if ironically instead of fire a layer of frost had covered every object, living or non-living. Her brave voice traveled several kilometers even though it was not powered by mana and even though she had done nothing more than speak in her usual tone of voice. It was as if the meaning behind her words, the skill itself, had to spread its name far and wide across the battlefield it would descend onto. Under the surprised eyes of everyone, especially Bai Zemin, Feng Tianwu's appearance underwent no small change. Although all this happened in the blink of an eye, to him and a handful of powerful soul evolvers with keen senses it was all clear enough as if they had been watching it bit by bit, second by second, and minute by minute. Her red hair became even brighter than before, but when the wind blew it was not crimson strands that moved but thin wisps of red flame that burned for an instant around her before disappearing. Her magic robe, despite being a rank 2 forged item with very good characteristics, turned to ashes and her entire body was immediately engulfed in red flames. No, it would probably be more correct to say that Feng Tianwu's curvaceous figure was similar to that of a fire spirit that could be seen in picture books. Even the color of her eyes changed, being now completely golden with burning flames. Bai Zemin did not have a chance to say anything when he saw Feng Tianwu wave her magic staff and soon, everything was changed by this seemingly simple gesture. Everything, even beyond where the eye could see, was soon engulfed in golden flames. The soul evolvers of the Transcendent faction were soon engulfed by these flames that rose up to their bodies and devoured them. Most of them shrieked in terror and the more desperate ones began to roll on the ground in an attempt to extinguish those flames. There were few who after a brief moment of panic at the overwhelming magical power that covered the area, regained their composure after realizing something. It was only after several seconds of shrieks and howls filled with horror that each of the soul evolvers and allied soldiers realized that despite being surrounded by flames, they were not suffering any harm or pain. The flames were just there, surrounding them just like the air that could not be seen, unharmed and unobstructed. But could the same be said of the enemies? Unfortunately for them, this was not the case. There was no groaning, no grunting, no roaring, and no whining. Starting from those closest to Feng Tianwu and spreading farther and farther away along with the growth of the domain of the god of fire Agni, the goblins and the mutant beasts of the marine race simply exploded into mortal spoils without leaving even bones behind. Even more terrifying, however, Xietain was shocked when he saw the black ashes simply decay and vanish from existence. Those golden flames. Xietain did not know how Feng Tianwu had obtained such a powerful skill, however, he was not optimistic enough to think that she could use this kind of power without prejudice, or else Feng Tianwu would not have waited until now. In fact, the power of those golden flames did not even seem to be hers. This was because Xietain did not believe that Feng Tianwu had under her control a flame more powerful than his endless blue lotus flame. Unfortunately, Xietain did not have time to stop and think too much as time was pressing. As the unranked, first order, and even second order enemies were incinerated as the golden flame spread further and further, he kicked the ground and soared into the sky like a torpedo. Even from a distance, when Xietain narrowed his eyes, he could see a figure wrapped in a large black cloak, staring at him with two glowing golden eyes hidden in the darkness of the hood covering their face. I will kill all the goblins and sea beasts below the third order. I can do nothing against those who are in the same order as me. Feng Tianwu's voice sounded a bit echoey for some reason. When he looked down, he saw that she was staring at him. You'll have to take care of the humans yourself. Xietain nodded. This was a settlement that he could use, and it was just what he needed. He was 5 third-order soul evolvers short of completing the requirement of 100, but Xietain didn't know if among the enemy ranks there were that many. Counting the leaders, there should only be 3. He could only pray that there were 2 more. Xietain only had about 2.5 more months before the 1-year time limit arrived. And when that occurred, he would forever lose the opportunity to obtain the Blood Mystic class, while all his efforts to get it would be wasted. Since he only wanted the best of the best, he had to work hard to have it. There was nothing free in this world, and the soul record was certainly making him pay to gain the power his breakthrough to the second order would provide. With a heavy stomp on the step of air beneath his feet, Xietain shot off towards the far wall of the enemy base, with his eyes fixed on the cloaked figure. The enemy was definitely a fourth-order being. Xietain had no doubt about this, as even if the demon lord was in front of him would not be able to really threaten him, considering the Blood Berserker's Wrath skill was active with 2 triggers at the same time. In a nutshell, my greatsword's Doombringer skill won't be useful against this enemy. Xietain frowned as he muttered to himself. The Doombringer skill was terrifying to both the enemy and the one wielding the weapon, sucking 30% of the wielder's health to punish the enemy with a subsequent 50% suction, a double-edged sword in every sense of the word. Unfortunately, Doombringer was limited by the order of the wielder of the greatsword. Xietain being a first-order existence, Doombringer's limit was third-order existences. The fourth order was beyond the maximum limit. The distance between Xietain and the enemy was wide, a few tens of kilometers. Therefore, he could at least take a moment to think about what to do now that his main weapon could not be used, since there was no point in wielding Blood Dragon Bringer of Doom knowing that the only one harmed would be himself. Unfortunately, Xietain had no information on the enemy other than knowing that it was a fourth-order existence. Male? Female? Human? Sea beast? Goblin? Mage? Assassin? Warrior? He knew nothing at all. Being in complete darkness, the beginning could not have been worse. However, Xietain was never the type to fear the unknown. Watching as the large cannon began to turn red hot and remembering what had happened earlier with Xietain Mayer, Xietain knew he had to hurry, so without delay he finished formulating what he thought was the most optimal plan in this case. Soul manipulation. At the wall, Tao Ji watched his enemy with a calm expression on his hidden face. Soon, however, he couldn't help but frown slightly as he sensed the change in the aura surrounding the human male. Lord Tao Ji, you are confident that you can win, right? Xian Kuan asked in a deep voice as he stroked the cosmic particle cannon. The smile on his face was no longer visible, and he somehow looked quite annoyed as he stared intently at the human in the distance. This was because during this whole stupid war, His army had fallen below 50% and Xietain would not be able to recover from this soon, considering that the overwhelming power of the other side did not allow him to go and collect the soul stones he had invested in the soldiers. Unless Tao Ji killed by Xietain and all the other soul evolvers, Xietain would probably have to retreat back to the East Sea and give up on his plan to conquer the mainland to use the land races to expand his territory in the seas. Tao Ji looked at Xietain out of the corner of his eye and said indifferently, "I will win. But it will be hard to kill this kid if he has more than 2 attacks capable of breaking the barrier of this world. I don't want to be sucked into a spatial crack and devoured by void." Xietan's expression was ugly as he used his mana to fire the cosmic particle cannon. Since that was the case, then he would take care of it himself. The lethality of the cosmic particle cannon was so high that even the fourth order existence standing beside him would not be able to survive a shot. Xietain was certain that no human should be able to survive a single shot from this weapon. As if knowing what he had in mind, Tao Ji snorted under his breath with a glint of disdain in his eyes. Just an instant before a brilliant flash of red light with blue lightning shot out from the muzzle of the large cannon. Although it was only for an instant, the light blinded everyone and the sky seemed to change color. However, when Xietain opened his eyes and saw the clouds in the sky opening outward with a large hole rising to the seeming infinity, he could not believe his eyesight. What? Seeing the human still charging towards them but from a slightly different position, Tao Ji narrowed his eyes, ignoring Xietan's incredulous exclamation. Tao Ji realized that this battle was going to be a bit more complicated now that he knew he was facing an enemy with a skill similar to foresight. He always hated seer-like soul evolvers because they were really troublesome and almost impossible to kill. As he got closer and closer, Xietain couldn't help but feel frustrated. He had only been able to dodge that attack because his danger sense skill, now evolved 1 order thanks to soul manipulation, allowed him to sense and know 1 second in advance where the danger would come from. Otherwise, it would have been impossible for him to dodge an attack capable of moving so fast. He had only been able to because he moved before the attack came out of the cannon. Simple. He activated Crimson Flash Lightning, receiving a nice agility boost, and immediately after activated Overlap Regeneration. Using 90% of his magic points, Xietain converted them into strength and agility, gaining a tremendous boost of physical power and speed thanks to soul manipulation, allowing him to take regeneration and thus overlap regeneration 1 order higher. Since the enemy had sent his greeting, then it would be rude of him not to send his own. Xietain extended his hand outward and the blood chains that followed him turned into a thick crimson spear. Still in full motion, he tensed the muscles of his right arm and using his nearly 6,000 strength points, threw it fiercely towards the enemy in the distance as a salute. A streak of white stained the sky as the blood spear seemed to disappear from everyone's sight, and the next moment there was a loud booming sound reverberating in the sky. To everyone's eyes, the blood spear simply teleported several kilometers away, and under the trembling pupils of the third prince, Xietain watched helplessly as the blood spear grew larger before his eyes at speeds infinitely faster than his reaction or movement speed. Just at that moment, an emerald green barrier appeared in the sky in front of the wall. Boom! The blood spear struck fiercely on the emerald green barrier, and after a brief moment, it exploded, unable to withstand the strength with which it had been thrown and the hardness of the barrier. Tao Ji slowly lowered his magic staff and the emerald barrier slowly began to disappear. Although the wall was safe, the surface rumbled constantly after being shaken by the sound of the previous explosion. Just as Xietain sighed in relief, the red blood that had begun to fall from the sky after the disappearance of the emerald barrier moved strangely, and in an instant dozens of thin strands swung fiercely towards his head. Xietain heard a low snort and a fiery flame shot out from his side, turning all the strands of blood into a pile of white mist that was soon sent far away with the strong winds blowing in the heights. It was at that brief moment when the third prince Xietain sighed in relief after having narrowly escaped the clutches of death, and Tao Ji turned to face Xietain again that both were surprised when they realized that The Camarca particle cannon that was right in front of them a moment before was now nowhere to be found. Chapter 968 Powerful Monster of the Past N. Back up? Where's the cannon? Xietain went into a frenzy, and his eyes became bloodshot as he searched everywhere in desperation. The cosmic particle cannon was priceless. Only Xietain knew how much he had paid his father to be able to borrow this cannon for a few months, and if he lost it or something bad happened, the consequences would be unbearable. Tao Ji also frowned, feeling a bit uncomfortable as he looked at the human male closing the distance faster and faster. What the hell had just happened with the cannon? Tao Ji hadn't felt anything at all. The cosmic particle cannon was a large object. The body was approximately 10 meters wide, and the cannon was over 60 meters long with a large muzzle of 5 meters wide through which enormous amounts of energy capable of blowing up an entire city passed. Therefore, for such a large and powerful thing to disappear right before his eyes made Tao Ji feel anything except a sense of relief. Xietain stopped 1 kilometer away from the base, and although his expression was indifferent, he was actually sighing in relief in his heart. The cosmic particle cannon was naturally now in his possession. It was precisely at this point that the third skill Xietain had raised using soul manipulation came in. Without the power of his main weapon, he would have to rely on strategy in addition to his personal power to deal with this enemy, and Xietain was quite proud of being quite cunning. Tao Ji soared through the air with gusts of wind around him that soon enclosed him in a semi-transparent sphere composed of nothing but air. He stopped 500 meters in front of Xietain and after a brief silence said, in a hoarse voice, "You want to fight in this place? Follow me." Xietain gestured with his head and without waiting for a reply kicked the air step under his feet, turning into a flash of golden light that disappeared into the distant horizon in an instant. Tao Ji looked at the members of the Transcendent faction, specifically at Feng Tianwu, who was looking at him indifferently. Instead of attacking, he followed Xietain and soon disappeared from everyone's line of sight as well. Xietain and Tao Ji were both aware that the battle between the two would be disastrous. Neither of them wanted to involve their allies if possible. In reality, Tao Ji did not care about anyone but Xietain, since his death would be a major problem for him. Therefore, he decided to play along with the human since it was to his advantage that way as well. Xietain knew that he had his time counted due to Feng Tianwu, therefore, after using all his strength and agility powered by overlap regeneration, moving over 100 kilometers away in no time, he immediately turned around and began his assault. A flash of golden light shot out from Xietan's chest and annihilation of the falling sky in the form of a bow appeared in his right hand at the same time as a fire arrow appeared in his left hand. Tao Ji did not even have time to stop as the fire arrow broke the sound barrier and fiercely exploded upon, impacting the wind sphere surrounding him. Xietain did not stop when he saw the blue flames covering part of the sky but continued to attack fiercely, launching fire arrow after fire arrow. He let the liquid storage pearl fall to the ground, and the small object fell from the clouds, disappearing in mere moments as the sky was tinged with deep blue. Rumble. The sky rumbled and the temperature rose higher and higher, causing the mountains below to begin to show signs of collapse. Just at that moment, Xietain sensed danger and hurriedly moved to his left at lightning speed, dodging by just a hair's breadth a thin beam of light blue light that shot out from the center of all the explosions caused by the arrows he launched. Bang! Suddenly, all the blue flames surrounding Tao Ji were easily expelled and he was revealed to be completely unharmed while the wind sphere still swirled around his body. Seeing this, Xietan's expression was a bit grim and he immediately realized that this battle was going to be disgustingly difficult to win. Even though all those previous attacks seemed to be casual attacks, the truth was that each arrow had enough power to turn a city into an entire hell and wipe out the lives of hundreds of thousands in an instant. The power of the endless blue lotus flame powered by a weapon with 8,000 physical attack points added to Xietan's nearly 6,000 strength points, accompanied by the 65% power granted by God of War's will skill charge to the maximum. Xietain really wasn't holding back, but the enemy repelled his attacks so easily. The fact that the sky was rumbling nonstop with such loudness as if it was about to crash down on the world was proof of how terrifying the result of the union of so many attacks had been. Tao Xi waved his magic staff and chanted softly, "Suppress." Bai Zemin's expression changed as he suddenly felt a surge of exhaustion at the same time as 3 messages flashed in his eyes. A weakening skill has been used on you. You possess soul manipulation and immovable heart. The effect of the enemy skill is weakened. All stats -5% for the next 60 minutes. Oh? Bai Zemin heard a small sound of genuine surprise coming from his enemy, but he didn't have time to chat. Since his enemy liked to play like this, then he would gladly play. Domain. Bai Zemin's voice had only fallen when the entire sky suddenly changed its color. The blue disappeared and was replaced by a blood-red color, the white clouds turned black, and on the distant horizon behind his enemy, Tao Xi saw 2 thin fringes open abruptly, revealing 2 golden eyes that looked down on the world with coldness and disdain. Ugh! A pained expression crossed Tao Xi's face as a message flashed in his eyes, shocking him to the marrow of his bones. You are now inside the Emperor Wolf domain. All your natural stats drop by 20%. In fact, as Tao Xi was watched by those 2 giant golden eyes, and he looked at the red wolf ghost behind the young human, he realized that the 20% was actually a bit higher, probably around 25% because of the red wolf. Feeling his right hand trembling as he clutched his magic staff, his reptilian lips curved upward slightly. He had deciphered where that 5% was coming from, and thus could now do something about it. I see. Tao Xi removed his hood, surprising Bai Zemin as he revealed an alligator-like head covered in light blue scales and glowing golden eyes with 2 thin straight lines in the shape of pupils. You certainly are impressive. Even your killing intent is surprisingly high. Tao Xi praised in a hoarse voice. I still don't quite understand what's happening in this world, but you certainly are interesting. Bai Zemin frowned as he sensed a bad premonition and without delay turned annihilation of the falling sky into a golden spear that he threw with all his might towards his enemy after activating Crimson Flame. The jade-colored stone on top of Tao Xi's magic staff glowed and the same emerald-colored barrier from before appeared before him, successfully blocking annihilation of the falling sky's advance. Boom! Rumble! The spear spun like a drill, trying to pierce the barrier at the same time as fierce gusts of wind danced around the tip of the spear. However, the barrier barely flinched and after several seconds the spear lost its strength before it began to fall. Bai Zemin reached out his right hand, and as he caught his spear he couldn't help but be surprised to see a red aura begin to surround the alligator man's body. To his utter disbelief, the image of the red wolf behind him became fainter and fainter until it soon disappeared without a trace. At the same time, the red aura surrounding Tao Xi became fainter and fainter before fading away. Both killing intentions had been nullified. However, Bai Zemin was not the only one surprised. To think that a child like you can match my killing intent. Tao Xi burst out laughing and said loudly, looks like I wasn't wrong when I got ready beforehand. It will be really fun to kill you before eating you, human warrior. Tao Xi's identity was a lot more surprising than Bai Zemin thought. That was why Tao Xi was so surprised to find such a young person who had been evolving for such a short time, able to accomplish such things. Even now, despite being able to nullify the red wolf's killing intent, Tao Xi was still weakened by the enemy domain. At the end of the day, a domain was the highest level a skill could theoretically reach and they were not easy to break or evade. However, Bai Zemin had no time to chat to learn more about his enemy. He coldly snorted and without delay lunged forward at the same time as the golden spear in his hands turned into a great sword as shiny as gold. Tao Xi waved his magic staff, and in less than a second the whole sky was filled with magic circles of all kinds of gold tones. Bai Zemin's feeling of danger practically paralyzed him as the danger of death filled him. This was the second time since he had started evolving that he felt so small and insignificant. This was a very similar, if not identical feeling to the one he felt when he was stuck in the spatial crack with Ghost Emperor Jack. Bright world. Tao Ji's voice had barely fallen when Bai Zemin was immediately surrounded by hundreds of thousands of golden light swords raining down from the thousands of magic circles at breakneck speeds. Mages were truly terrifying, and Tao Ji's magic power was so horrifying that Bai Zemin felt small even with all the boosts he had. He did not dare to take those attacks head-on in any way, and despite his anxiety to end it all as quickly as possible, Bai Zemin had no choice but to stop his charge. Halfway through, with a sudden gold flash, the golden greatsword turned into a long golden whip, and with astonishingly fast movements Bai Zemin began to swing the whip up into the sky and down to the ground, causing the surroundings to glow in the radiance of annihilation of the falling sky. As Tao Ji watched with ever-widening eyes as each lash shattered the golden light swords, he couldn't help but mutter in astonishment, "He is breaking my magic." The Bright World skill was a third-order level 5 skill, and despite not being Tao Ji's most powerful, it was one of the best when it came to covering several kilometers in length and breadth to finish off several enemies at the same time or to put one in a tight spot, just like in this case. If Bai Zemin used a shield or some other method to block his magic skill, then Tao Ji would accept it, but to use physical attacks to break and in the process completely nullify the power of a magic skill, this was something even he, a monster with millions of years of life, had never seen. Looks like I'll have to finish the game early. This isn't fun anymore, Tao Ji muttered as he pointed his magic staff at the back of Bai Zemin, who was several hundred meters ahead battling to break all the magic swords. The green-colored stone on top of the magic staff glowed, and a very huge silver magic circle appeared a few centimeters from the stone. Bai Zemin naturally sensed the huge fluctuation of mana and magic power at his back and knew that the skill on the way might be too much for him to handle simply by using magic break. Unfortunately, this was one of the disadvantages of not knowing anything about the enemy one will face. If he had known that his enemy was a mage, he had used soul manipulation to raise the order of magic break by one stage. Bai Zemin didn't even have room to move as he was surrounded by magic swords, making any dodging whatsoever not an option. Even if he dodged the magic attack from behind, his body would be hit by thousands of magic swords, and considering how high the enemy's magical power was, he would definitely end up with medium-grade injuries at the very least. Should I use that? But if I use blood manipulation to create weapons or shields, my plan will go to waste, and it will be practically impossible for me to kill this alligator. Just as Bai Zemin found himself in a great predicament from which he had no way to escape on his own, a high-pitched sound similar to a phoenix's cry echoed from the distance, and out of the corner of his eye, he could just barely see a flash of purple light passing by him. Chapter 969 Bing Shui Xingyue Zemin vs. Tao Ji. Bai Zemin only had time to move his eyes slightly to the left and turn his head enough to see a flash of bright silver light blinding his line of sight, since before he could do any more he saw the flash of silver light and the flash of purple light collide with each other. Boom! As his body was sent flying due to the power of the explosion, Bai Zemin activated gravity manipulation on a small area around his body such that the golden swords raining down on him had been greatly weakened after hitting different parts of his armor. He kept his eyes wide open at all times, and what he saw was how the silver light that covered half of the sky stagnated for a moment before quickly devouring the neon purple light that covered the other half of the sky. Rumble. Bai Zemin had no time to stabilize his body as he was quickly forced to move after sensing mortal danger when the silver light continued to fly towards him upon losing approximately 70% of its power during the previous collision with the neon purple light. This all happened at the same time as he once again used annihilation of the falling sky in its whip form along with magic break to shatter the enemy's magic that kept raining out from all directions. Electric World. At the same time as a familiar voice came from the distance, the black clouds in the Emperor Wolf domain became even darker than before with purple lights flickering inside. And before Bai Zemin could say a single word, countless flashes of purple light rained out from the clouds. Boom! 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 The power of the magical golden swords lay in their numbers capable of causing cumulative wounds quickly by covering a large area without giving the enemy time to escape and practically taking away the 100% of dodge possibilities. However, although the purple lightning flashes were fewer in number, their power was a lot more focused on destruction. Every time a purple lightning flash rained out of the clouds, it covered thousands of golden swords at the same time with its large size. The golden swords only resisted for a brief moment before being disintegrated by the higher magic power within. Each lightning flash and the remaining power of each lightning strike was enough to crush at least one magic circle with each explosion. With the enemy's bright world skill being shattered by a skill with less extension but more magic concentration, Xietain had time to look towards the source of the voice, and when he narrowed his eyes it didn't take long to confirm his earlier suspicion. Two fierce whirlwinds of black wind with flashes of purple lightning were rapidly approaching from the horizon, just like a storm of never-before-seen proportions, and right in the upper eye of each whirlwind moving horizontally to the distant ground was a person. Xietain couldn't help but sigh in relief when he saw that they were Shangguan Bingshui and her mother, Shangguan Xinyue. The voice and the skill from before belonged precisely to Shangguan Xinyue. Before he could say anything, Xietain saw Shangguan Xinyue point her index finger forward, and soon the two whirlwinds seemed to pick up speed, devouring both her and Shangguan Bingshui for an instant before both attacks charged straight towards Tao Ji. Decent magic power. Tao Ji nodded calmly as he watched the two giant whirlwinds make him look like a miniature and casually raised his magic staff. But it's still not enough. Roaring flare. Tao Ji's voice spread across the sky as a magic circle whose width was comparable to the height of a 10-story building flashed in front of him. An instant later, a dragon-like roar rumbled in the sky and could be heard from a distance as a flare of fire shot out from the magic circle, covering the sky in an instant and devouring the two giant whirlwinds as if they were toys. Rumble. The sight was truly breathtaking and terrifying. If one were to look from a distance, one could see how most of the sky was filled with flames, and the most terrifying thing was that those flames were shooting out from the front of what from a distance was nothing more than a small black dot in the sky. Xietain had no time to exchange greetings with the newcomers. Talks would have to wait for later. Even though the silhouettes of Shangguan Xinyue and Shangguan Bingshui had disappeared into the flames of the enemy, he was confident that both women were strong enough not to fall so easily. It wasn't as if he had much of a choice anyway. Not when the enemy possessed skills and stats that even surpassed him despite being at his maximum possible state. Seizing the opportunity he had been given, Xietain soared high into the sky as he activated Crimson Flame to boost his physical attack power by an extra 20%. Crimson flames engulfed the blade of annihilation of the falling sky now in its greatsword form, and an instant later a flash of blue flames glowed, joining with the bright blood-colored flames to form a new bright purple flame. Tao Ji continued to use his overwhelming magic power to push the power of his roaring flame skill higher and higher when he suddenly felt something. He abruptly raised his head just in time to see a flash of purple light falling at dizzying speeds over his head, and purely out of instinct rooted deep within him, he activated his strongest defensive skill, falling from over 1,000 meters above the enemy's head while pushing his falling speed even further after. Activating gravity manipulation x 30 times the Earth's natural gravity, Xietain raised annihilation of the falling sky high and with a fierce expression on his face activated his second most powerful destructive skill within his arsenal as he slashed without holding back at all downwards, rumbling the heavens, shaking the earth, as annihilation of the falling sky engulfed in purple flames struck the top of the enemy's emerald green barrier. All sound seemed to be silenced for a moment just as the black clouds within the Emperor Wolf domain froze in place. Rumble. Boom. Followed by a faint rumbling that began to grow louder and louder. An explosion that completely exceeded all others caused black cracks to appear everywhere as the Earth's natural space law barrier began to show signs of collapse. Mountains more than 2,000 meters below the battlefield exploded as the ferocious shockwave hit them. Giant-sized rocks turned to dust, and soon not only the sky rumbled but even the ground shook. Watching as the black cracks grew larger and larger, Tao Xi's expression changed, and he hurriedly broke off a stone fragment with golden-colored magic runes written on the surface. A strange fluctuation seeped from the small stone fragment at the same time as the power of the gold-colored magic runes spread out in the form of an invisible wave at a speed that exceeded the speed of sound by a large margin. In a matter of fractions of a second, the terrifying black cracks began to seal once again, and although the destructive power was still damaging the world's spatial barrier, it was not enough to overcome the speed at which the cracks were being sealed. Crack. Tao Xi's pupils contracted to the size of needles as the distinct sound of something cracking sounded just above his head. He didn't have time to rejoice and sigh in relief as he raised his head once again to find two red eyes staring at him with a bloodthirsty expression from beyond the now cracked emerald green barrier. Impossible! Tao Xi roared in his mind. This barrier-like skill was a level 5 fourth order skill. Even powerful enemies Tao Xi had faced in the past had spent more than a hard time trying to break it without much success. Although Tao Xi wasn't underestimating the young human in front of him at all, this was a sight he hadn't expected to see even in his most distant dreams. Crack. 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 It had only been an instant, a flicker of time. However, that flicker had been enough for the cracks to spread across half of the magical barrier, and from the other side, Tao Xi could feel the burning heat of the purple flames trying to incinerate him now that his defense had been weakened. He snorted and with an angry expression on his face pointed his magic staff upwards. Despite knowing what was coming, Bai Zemin did not back down. This was a great opportunity that he could not miss no matter what. Making use of the still latent power of the skill rumbling the heavens, shaking the earth as well as the momentum he had gained after falling from above attracted by a 30 times earth gravity, Bai Zemin continued to activate Magic Break repeatedly while using his nearly 6,000 strength points to press down. Magic Break was a skill that in theory allowed Bai Zemin to find the weak points of all magic. However, Magic Break was limited by the power scale of Bai Zemin himself despite being a 6th order skill. Fortunately, the power of Bai Zemin could not be measured by his order. Unfortunately, however, the barrier of the enemy was powerful enough to withstand even after receiving such a powerful blow on its weakest point. Ruler of all matter. Just as a strange aura surrounded Bai Zemin's body, Tao Xi activated his skill. Undaunted Light. All Bai Zemin saw was a flash of white light that forced him to close his eyes before his body was struck. Half of the power that hit him simply disappeared before it could harm him thanks to the power of Ruler of all matter, but the other half was enough to cause him considerable damage. As his body was sent flying upwards like a kite whose string had been cut, Bai Zemin was grateful for the fact that his body's pain sensors were deactivated due to Blood Berserker's Wrath skill. The front of his armor sank inward, squeezing his chest and making him spit out a mouthful of blood. The enemy's magic power was so horrifying that only 50% had managed to cause him so much damage. However, when Tao Xi saw the smile on Bai Zemin's face, he realized that something was not right. "I'll give it back to you," roared Bai Zemin as he pointed downwards while his body continued to fly upwards. Swoosh! 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 A flash of white light shot out from Bai Zemin's body, and before Tao Xi could do anything he watched with eyes filled with disbelief as some of the power of his Undaunted Light skill flew towards him and fiercely struck the weakened defensive barrier. Boom! The breaking of the magical barrier pushed Tao Xi back so hard that even with his body protected by a sphere of wind, his face distorted into a grimace of pain. It was just then that Tao Xi realized a problem, the fact that he was now fighting more than one enemy. Bing Shui! Bai Zemin's voice thundered through the clouds just an instant before a beautiful but cold voice was heard from within the flames thrown earlier by Tao Xi. Inferno. Chapter 972 Surprise attacks at the same time. It was certain that Shangguan Bingshui was walking a path destined to lead her to possess great control over the battlefield and her enemies in general. She, just like Bai Zemin and any other currently powerful soul evolvers, had carefully chosen her skills and did not learn actives just to gain some immediate power but focused on continuous growth for better long-term performance in the future. However, the fact that Shangguan Bingshui was a soul evolver with great crowd control abilities did not mean that in a 1 versus 1 battle she was weak, even if her true ability was destined to show more on a battlefield with numerous enemies. She possessed powerful skills, and among them, her most powerful skill in explosive and destructive terms was precisely Inferno. Bai Zemin was forced to close his eyes as a blinding flash covered his vision, and at the same time as a terrifying heat wave hit the area, he quickly thought of retreating but soon found himself being swept away by a gust of wind at the same time as an unfamiliar but somehow familiar scent enveloped him. "Looks like you ran into a troublesome enemy, little king." Shangguan Xinyue's voice sounded in Bai Zemin's ears at the same time as his body was blown away by powerful gusts of wind. He did not fight back, and when he opened his eyes he was shocked by what he saw. A huge column of yellow flames seemed to split a large part of the battlefield in two. The column of flames was so thick that a building would look miniature in comparison. Moreover, the column of flames was so terrifying that it seemed to be the support of the sky, as Bai Zemin could see how the dirt on the ground was turned into lava and the havoc spread everywhere. This was the second time Bai Zemin saw Shangguan Bingshui using Inferno, but compared to the previous time it was like comparing the flame of a lighter to the flame of a volcano. There was simply no room to compare at all. Soon, Bai Zemin found himself standing next to Shangguan Bingshui and Shangguan Xinyue. He frowned as he saw that, although they were both fine, their faces were slightly pale. In addition, Bai Zemin also noticed a trace of a burn on Shangguan Bingshui's left arm. She obviously had not been able to get out of the earlier magic attack unscathed. "Bingshui, are you all right?" he asked with genuine disquiet. Shangguan Bingshui had a serious expression on her face, illuminated by the glow of the column of yellow flames, still burning in the distance. Her white hair fluttered wildly because of the wind surrounding them, but she focused on using her right hand extended outward as a connector to feed the magical power of her Inferno skill, with more and more mana. "Don't worry. I'm okay," Shangguan Bingshui said, even though she was actually experiencing great pain as the enemy's mana kept worsening the burn. She held her eyes fixed on the pillar of fire and asked in a serious voice, "What's with that alligator? Is it the unknown enemy you told me about previously?" "Yeah." Bai Zemin nodded with a frown as he looked toward the pillar of fire with a serious expression. "He's stronger than I expected. I have to admit that I'm not confident of beating him in a 1 versus 1 as he seems to have prepared beforehand to fight me." For the past 2 months, Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bingshui kept in touch, so even though they hadn't seen each other in over 60 days, the two had heard each other's voice at least one time every 2 nights, with the only exception being the last half-month. Thanks to their constant nightly chats, Bai Zemin had a good idea of how things were in southern China, and Shangguan Bingshui had a broad picture of how things were on the battlefield in Inner Mongolia. Therefore, she knew that Bai Zemin could not unleash his full strength as he needed to save mana, stamina, and hide some trump cards in case the fourth-order enemy in the enemy ranks attacked. Wouldn't it be stupid to use, for example, blazing blood punishment, to kill countless unranked enemies and thus save the lives of a few thousand allies at the cost of losing his most powerful skill, which could give way for the enemy to attack and perhaps wipe out the entire allied army? It was just that Shangguan Bingshui did not expect the enemy to be this strong. She had headed north immediately after receiving no news from Bai Zemin or the main army, and now she felt fortunate that she had made that decision. "That alligator's magic power is too high. It melted my ice wall in a matter of seconds," Shangguan Bingshui said in a serious voice. "I don't even have confidence in inflicting serious damage to him with Inferno, so I hope you have something in store about that." As Bai Zemin told his plan, Shangguan Bingshui and Shangguan Xinyue's eyes lit up. However, after hearing the final part, both women frowned. Are you sure you'll be okay? Shangguan Bingshui asked worriedly. Well, we just have to do it, Bai Zemin said with a shrug. Shangguan Bingshui glared at him and it was obvious that her anger was rising. However, before she could say anything, Shangguan Bingshui was interrupted by her mother. Bingshui, since our little king has a plan, then let's do our best to help him. Shangguan Xinyue frowned as she looked at the pillar of flames and said in a low voice, I'm afraid it's not like we have much of a choice here. Shangguan Xinyue was a level 156 soul evolver whose magic power was frighteningly high, so much so that even her daughter could not defeat her in a heavy combat. However, she could sense that the enemy was in a completely different league. Believe in me. Bai Zemin nodded as he handed her an earring exactly like the one he had given Lilith before. She left, except this one did not have the legend-grade feather. This will surely help more than a little. Shangguan Bingshui looked at the earring in surprise and subconsciously took it using her left hand, which earned her a wince of pain when she moved her arm. However, all pain disappeared when she saw the object's records. Unfortunately, she didn't have time to be surprised as she immediately felt the power of her skill begin to fade, so she hurriedly took off the earring from her right ear and exchanged it for the one Bai Zemin had given her. In just a second, Shangguan Bingshui activated Ice Maker and created small square objects. For small ice cubes that contained over 700 mana points each, Bai Zemin quickly activated Crimson Lightning Flash and created 4 clones of himself. Each clone took 1 ice cube piece before disappearing as if they had vanished into thin air, much to the surprise of the 2 females next to him. Neither of them had time to ask questions when they heard a slightly angry voice coming from the pillar of flame. To think that a first-order soul evolver and a second-order soul evolver would be able to harm me to this extent. Boom! The pillar of flames exploded outward and a great whirlwind blew in all directions. As flames rained down from the sky onto the now snowless ground, Tao Ji rose up enveloped in strong winds as he stared with murderous intent at the group of 3. The black cloak covering his body was gone, revealing a dark green magic robe with golden embroidery. However, except for the parts that the magic robe covered, both the hands and part of the arms and half of the scales on Tao Ji's face had half scorched off. Die. Tao Ji pointed his magic staff and said in a slightly cold voice, Black Calamity. Under the incredulous eyes of Bai Zemin and the 2 females beside him, a huge black portal-like mouth suddenly opened in front of Tao Ji and a simply giant claw-like hand shot forward without warning. Lightning Dragon. Shangguan Xinyue pointed forward and a purple dragon over 500 meters long roared high into the clouds before plummeting towards the claw covered in black scales. Despite its size, however, the lightning dragon Shangguan Xinyue had formed using the atmosphere to her advantage was as small as a worm in front of a snake, and after hitting the black claw it exploded violently. Boom! Part of the black claw was covered with purple flashes, but its advance did not stop at all, and upon seeing this Shangguan Xinyue raised both hands towards the sky and called several lightning dragons that assaulted the claw one after another. Despite her tremendously pale face due to the previous mana consumption, Shangguan Bingshui unsheathed her sword and slashed diagonally, which caused a huge amount of white mist to shoot forward. Blizzard. Thanks to Shangguan Xinyue's high magic power and Shangguan Bingshui's crowd control ability, as well as her high magic power, the colossal black claw finally began to lose a bit of speed and power. Bai Zemin did not attempt to dodge the incoming attack. If it was that easy, then they would have done it before, but he and the 2 women beside him could feel that the enemy magic attack was fixed on them, so evading it was probably going to be more troublesome than facing it. As the black claw was covered by a layer of ice with purple lightning binding it like chains, Bai Zemin tightened his grip on annihilation of the falling sky wrapped in purple flames and with a mighty stomp, shot forward. Taking advantage of the momentum of speed, he used all his strength to fiercely slash forward at the same time as his voice spread out like a roar in the middle of the sky, rumbling the heavens, shaking the earth, thanks to the fact that annihilation of the falling sky was an indestructible weapon. Xietain didn't have to worry about overusing rumbling the heavens, shaking the earth. However, what happened next made his blood run cold. After his weapon struck the claw's open palm, the sky rumbled as if it would collapse at the burst of power that Xietan's attack had. But to his disbelief, Xietain felt the half behind the physical power of his attack disappear as soon as it came into contact with the enemy attack. It was only after seeing several giant scales shatter and red blood pour out of the large claw that Xietain understood what was happening. You thought that because I'm a mage I don't have my physical attacking ways? Tao Ji snorted and rose even higher as he waved his staff. A golden-colored magic spear appeared behind his back and while pointing forward he said coldly, "You're still too green, you brats." Roar. The claw retreated towards what Xietain now knew was a portal after being wounded, and as Xietan's body flew backwards over 200 meters, he quickly used this to his advantage to head towards Shangguan Bing Shui. Swoosh. Xietain felt a presence behind him, glaring at his back with burning fury. He waved his left hand from the bottom up and shouted loudly, "Bing Shui, do it now." Hurry! Shangguan Bing Shui was also shocked. The presence that was trying to come out of the portal had literally ruined everything they had planned before. However, she wasn't second in command of the Transcendent faction, only below 1 and above millions for nothing. Endless ice. Shangguan Bing Shui's voice had barely fallen when Tao Ji's expression changed slightly as he sensed 4 fluctuations of mana not far from where he stood from 4 different corners. Before he could even take another breath, 4 clones identical to Xietain appeared, forming a 4-cornered square, enclosing Tao Ji and the portal inside. Invisible? Don't tell me. The cosmic particle cannon too. Swoosh. 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 Tao Ji's pupils contracted fiercely at the thought of something and ignoring the huge sphere of ice exploding outward from the 4 ice cubes in the clone's hands, he abruptly turned his head back just in time to see a flash of red light approaching at astonishing speeds from the base 100 kilometers to the south. An even more frightening fluctuation of mana engulfed Tao Ji, and just at that moment, before the huge ice sphere closed, he saw the young human male catching a crimson trident, engulfed in purple flames that had come from the ground as if it had a life of its own. Within a split second of the ice creation closing, Xietain turned 360 degrees and ferociously threw the blood trident forward, making full use of his nearly 6,000 strength points. Blazing blood punishment. The sound barrier shattered, and just before it was too late, Xietain caught a glimpse of his attack hitting the creature in the portal.